Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. Very nice to see everybody managed to find this session okay. I'm going to shortly be joined again by Janet King, who's going to talk us through the content for the occupational specialisms and talk about the delivery and go through the sample assessments. So just a quick look at the agenda and where we are in the running order of things. Following this session, we'll have a short comfort break and have our last session of the day, which will be brought to you by the Learning Technologies and Resources team. Again, the running of this session will be much like what we did with the core. So rather than launch polls, which I suspect might take up time that I think everybody's getting quite a lot out of the exchanges happening in the chat box, both in terms of feedback on the assessments, but also sharing ideas and taking the general temperature of the room in terms of how people are feeling about delivering the qualification. I think the chat box is going to be our primary mode of collecting that feedback and engaging with you. So thank you so much for your engagement so far, and please keep your suggestions coming, because it's really helping these sessions quite a lot. So without further ado, Janet.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've had a chance to at least grab a coffee and a small bite to eat in that short interval. Okay, so if we just re-engage and sort of focus on where we were. So we've looked at the core, we've looked at those 12 elements, we've thought about how schemes of work could help us through a thematic approach to deliver that. The students have gone through paper A, paper B, and an employer set project. What we're going to do now is think about, okay, specialising or taking a pathway within education and childcare. And the T-level qualification allows us to do just that. So there's a core of consolidated, shared, common ground, if you like, for students that are in an early years discrete class or assisting teaching, or indeed further down the line in FE and HE mentoring. But following that, students will select an occupational specialism that they will focus on. Now, as I sort of alluded to earlier, it could well be, and I anticipate that it is more likely, that you will have a discrete class of early year students and or a discrete class of those that are doing the supporting teaching and learning, the assisting teaching specialism. Alternatively, you may have fewer students and they may be together for the core delivery, and then they will be studying discrete pathways at this stage. Whatever sort of mode of delivery you follow, when we get to this part of a T-level program, this is the actual contextualization of all of that knowledge. And this is where that sort of application of theory is going to really support the delivery in context. Now, so you may have early year students in a class, assisting teaching in the class, or you may have a combined class. And I think, Lucy, I think a comment just came in from yourself to say that actually students are going to be studying for the core together. So some early year students and some assisting teaching, that's absolutely fine because the content is going to be the same, and then they're going to apply it. And I think in terms of as they make those choices, it could well be that you make the choice in a way by what you offer, and so it's important to bear that in mind. But there will be opportunities to be able for students to be able to decide on a concrete pathway, if you like, towards this occupational specialism year. What we have got to bear in mind, is that students who are doing an early years specialism or pathway will have an enormous amount of placement to do, and so it's important that early years students in particular start their placement as early as possible. Those people amongst us now that are delivering early years diplomas at the moment, for example, will know how important it is to start that placement journey early on, not only to develop and blossom into the world of work and find confidence as a member of staff and as part of a team, but importantly, in order to meet the competencies in terms of early years educator. And early years educator criteria is embedded within the occupational specialism for early years, and that is why, as we go through this afternoon, you'll see that there is an increased number of placement hours given over to the early years specialism. In terms of can we offer more than one specialism, you'll be able to offer different specialisms. So you can have students that are doing early years and or supporting teaching and learning, assisting teaching, and it will be at your discretion in terms of what we offer. And that might well be, you know, down to class sizes, down to logistics and practical staffing issues, or you may want to focus in on one rather than the other, but that is certainly something that will be at your discretion. Sorry, thank you, Rachel. Okay, so when we spoke this morning, and Rachel and I have both spoke about the core content and emphasised that grading structure, which was A star through to E, what we're looking at now, if you remember, is a structure that is based around competencies. So whilst we do have some knowledge here, it is the application of that knowledge in context that is going to be what's challenging students and testing students here. And the criteria now is looking at performance outcomes, and the grading is switching now to pass, merit, distinction. So in the early years educator pathway or specialism, there are 5 performance outcomes. And again, these, if you're offering across education and childcare at the moment, and in particular early years, you won't find that there's anything here that jumps up to surprise you. So performance outcome 1, support and promote children's play, development and early education. Performance outcome 2, develop relationships with children to facilitate their development. Performance outcome 3, plan, provide and review care, play and educational opportunities to enable children to progress. 4, safeguard and promote the health, safety and well-being of children. And finally 5, work in partnership with colleagues, parents, carers and other professionals to support children's development. And of course what you'll see there is a great connect to the education and childcare core content. So whilst that big umbrella in that core content delivery has been looking at all of these things in general and looking at how these things are imposed with a 0 to 18 years range, this now is taking that and contextualizing it and focusing in on a particular specialism. And the one we're looking at the moment is early years educator. Now, the schemes of work that we've been talking about that I believe some of you may have already seen in their draft format there will identify the connections between the core and the occupational specialism so that you are able to bring in some of that contextualized learning if that helps to make sense. And for those that have got a combined group of early years and assisting teaching, you'll be able to see where the connections are in both of those specialisms, and you'll be able to bring meaning into your classroom delivery that you can pick up on again rather than start from the beginning. We all know what that feels like. So the idea of being able to use some of that contextualized learning right from the beginning will be threaded throughout your scheme of work. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so occupational specialism content for assisting teaching is arranged in 4 performance outcomes. Support the class teacher to enhance children's education individually and in groups. Plan, provide and review educational opportunities in collaboration with teachers and other adults. Safeguard and promote the health, safety and well-being of children and young people. and recognise, adapt and respond to individual children's needs, including those with SEND, to support development and access to the curriculum. And what we can see in both of these performance outcomes, in both of these specialisms, is actually we can see the connection with apprenticeship standards, which should be seen because we're looking at somebody being work ready. We're looking at a consistent approach here in terms of learning and knowledge. And what you will also be able to see here is that there's a familiarity across the specialisms, across the performance outcomes, in terms of planning, in terms of educational awareness, and in terms of legislation and supporting individual children's needs. And that is reflected in the assignments that we'll go on to look at later this afternoon. Thank you, Rachel. So, touched on this slightly at the beginning of this session, and let's just spend some time to make sure that we understand this. So, placement hours are different between the early years educator and assisting teaching, and in fact the early years educator one being the exception to all T-levels as I understand it at the moment, and that is simply because threshold competence within the early years has got to enable a student to be able to enter the world of work and be part of that early years workforce within Ratio, working in a supervisory capacity at level 3. What we can't have is have a T-level program that is supposed to be bringing something new, bringing progression, and being refreshed and so on, that doesn't allow that to happen. That would just be ridiculous. So this qualification embeds 750 placement hours, and that's allowing that student who's doing an early years program to be able to meet the early years educator criteria. We have had confirmation from the Department for Education that this pathway for early years as part of the Education and Childcare T-Level will sit on the full and relevant list. So that should reassure you, your students and employers alike. And we'll be doing our best as well to make sure that that information is well publicised wherever it needs to be. So assisting teaching 315 and 750 for the early years educator students. Okay, sorry, thank you, Rachel. Okay, so what does that mean for those students? What will that feel like? So we're looking now at the early years educator, and we look at this overall planner here. If we look at what's in that rectangle, that highlighted space there at the bottom, towards the bottom of this Gantt chart, you'll see that there are 3 assignments within this occupational specialism. Again, they are subject to pass, merit and distinction, and there's the element of externality across all of those assignments. Assignment 2 is a little bit more complicated, and I'll make sure we spend some time looking at that in isolation. But as an overall bird's eye view, this diagram is very useful in terms of we've got a synoptic assignment 1, that's coming towards the end of that occupational specialism. We've got assignment 2 that is all about competencies, all about meeting the skills requirements for the early years educator. That's going on throughout the 2-year program. And part 1, if you'll notice there, and this is significant because this is the difference, occupational specialism assignment 2 has got 2 parts in the early years educator specialism. Part 1 is all the way through those 2 years. That's your formative observations, your professional discussions, and that is your centre assessor going in, looking at skills, and they'll be given guidance as to what skills and so on that they need to achieve through that observation and professional discussion type approach, something that you're familiar with. And that is going to be pass only, and that will be meeting the early years educator criteria. we'll look at examples further down the line. Assignment 2, part 2, is slightly different because what we did need to satisfy is an externality. And as you and I know, externalities and practical competencies are difficult to achieve. So the way that we have, again, our intention, the way that we have set proposals for this is to actually think about, okay, certain aspects of structured observation. So our students have gone through the occupational specialism part 1, and they've met that criteria for early years educator. We now want to be able to give past merit and distinction, certainly merit distinction opportunities for those students who are, you know, indeed blossoming in their placements and so on. And there's an opportunity now through professional discussion and further structured observation, of which there are 3, towards the end, or when you know they're ready for their structured observations to take place. And those structured observations will carry a score. So they will be marked and then collaborated to be able to help those students to gain through those grade boundaries of merit and distinction. And again, we'll look at some examples. So in a nutshell, what we've got assignment 1 that is looking at planning, and we'll look at that through an example in a moment. We've got assignment 2 for the early years that is split into a part 1 and a part 2. Part 1, very much what you're used to at the moment, very much focusing on meeting the early years educator criteria. And a part 2 that enables students through a process of 3 structured observations and professional discussions to gain scores, because the assessor will mark them, and those marks and scores will contribute to a pass merit distinction overall. And then we have part 3 of this, assignment 3, which is looking very much at observation and the power of observation, why we use it, how we use it for interventions, and so on. There will be some moderation for assignment 2, and that at the moment is being worked on and being developed in our QA team. So there may be some questions that we can give broad answers to, but we may not be able to give definitive answers around moderation at this moment, because it is under development with our QA team at the moment. And you'll notice there that the results are going to be issued in line with A-level results, so towards the end of that occupational specialism year. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so we've had the bird's eye view, we know where our students are up to. Let's just do a bit of a deeper dive now and see what's going on. Thank you. Okay, so regardless of specialism, so you may have early years educator, assisting teaching, there are going to be 3 assignments within that specialism. 1 will be concerned with planning, 1 will be concerned with skills and competencies, and 1 will be concerned with observation. Observations marked internally by the assessor, and the EQA will be able to offer support here. So how is that looking in terms of delivery and in terms of a student's perspective? So we've got assignment 1 that's 2.5 hours. This is the planning activity. Assignment 2 that will be spread throughout the year, but with set sort of times allocated for assessing, involving those structured assessments as well, those 3 observations, and 4 hours allocated to assignment 3. and you can see the weighting and how that will be allocated. I just want to reassure assessors that are looking now and thinking about how this will happen. For early years and for assisting teaching, there's opportunity to offer that informative feedback that and so on for the assisting teaching. But for early years educator, you're going to be working in a very similar way to what you're working now, and again, dedicated EQA representatives from across the team will be able to support you. And of course, there'll be plenty of opportunity to work with assessors in terms of this new mindset. You know, they're used to making assessment judgments, not necessarily used to making scores and making a judgment based on a score. Marking, for example, is going to be something that may be potentially new to a lot of the assessors, and there'll be a lot of support and guidance available to help. So that gives you an idea there in terms of the early years educator and the different assessments and so on that are happening. And I think, as before, when Rachel was gathering thoughts perhaps about any questions that you may have on this, where you think it would be useful to have additional teaching opportunities and forums like this for us to chat, it might be useful to think about that as well as we go through. Thank you, Rachel. Let's do an even deeper dive. Okay, so assignment 1, remember this is around planning. Let's take a look. So if we think, and we stay with early years for a moment, this particular paper, as I said, it's all around planning. So in your role as an early years practitioner, you are required to support the care, learning and development of all children. In order to do this, you will plan educational activities to promote children's progression. You must plan 2 educational activities. Educational activity 1 will focus on physical development, and educational activity 2 will focus on literacy. Both educational activities will be to support children aged 3 to 4 years, and each must be at least 20 minutes in length. It then goes on to give you some context for that. So as a childcare practitioner working in a nursery, you've got access to a green outdoor space. You know that the children are interested in nature, and mini beasts is highlighted here. So you've been asked to plan 2 educational activities, each lasting at least 20 minutes for a small group, and it's identifying there that that's no more than 6 children. It then gives you a bit more context. One of the children within the small group has very recently joined the nursery, so you're thinking now or your students thinking now of what that transition means and so on. And one of the other children within the small group has got some concerns around concentration and self-regulation. Thank you, Rachel. So, using the information above, write 2 educational activity plans on this topic. The educational activities must be appropriate to the age and individual needs of all children within the small group. Your educational activity plans should be able to be used by another occupationally competent childcare practitioner who has not seen them before. So, you know, there's a hint there at the kind of detail required in all relevant considerations. Learning objectives linked to the early years foundation stage, opportunities for holistic development, the early years practitioner's role, including working with others, links to theoretical and philosophical approaches, pedagogical strategies used in supporting children's learning and development, and back to the EYFS there with characteristics of effective learning. And so there's going to be 2 educational activities that need to be planned. And each of those must include that sort of information. Now remember as well, like we said before with the A star to E, this is about past merit distinction, and so students will be able to access this at the level that they're at. But those students that blossom in their placements will be able to use and reflect on some of the things that are going on, and that they can relate to in their own placement experience, and things that they would do, and reasonings why, which will support them in this. Thank you. So,
I just invite people to feedback chat box. I won't be deploying the polls, but if you have feedback around, for example, the accessibility, the level, and when you're thinking about your own cohort and your own students, like how they would approach activities like this, anything that comes up for you, please in chat. We can share that with well, across all of us here, but also hear from Janet about responses to those considerations if they've come up before.
Thank you, Rachel. Shall we let people have a couple of minutes to do that?
Yeah, sure. I was just about to say that there are a couple of questions that came up during the chat about the content of the occupational specialisms. I just want to let people know that I've made a little note of these, and we will come back to them at the opportune.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. So if you want to just give yourselves just a couple of minutes, just think about, okay, what do I think about an activity around planning? And what you're looking at here is an example of such. You will also be given examples of completed paper so that you can see what sorts of things might constitute a distinction, what sort of things would constitute a pass. So that will give you as tutors an idea of that. I've just opened up the chat box so that I can also see the sorts of conversations that are going on at the moment, which is really useful. And it's good to see that there's an appreciation of the theory to practice, which is really what the Institute intended for these occupational specialisms. It's all about contextualization, and absolutely there will be templates, yes.
So it seems similar to the employer set project, that this kind of format is much more familiar and more comfortable in line with standard practice, especially for early years. I'm hoping that it's okay if I take the comments in the chat box as sort of indicative of the general feeling, but if there's anything else that comes up, do put it in there.
Okay, Rachel, shall we move on? And this, for those amongst us that are looking, in particular, are concerned with the early years side of the specialism, this is perhaps where things are slightly complicated in terms of them being a little bit different. And what that means is, because of that 750 placement hours, placement must begin as early as possible. You and I both know, we all know, that actually starting your work experience as early as you can in the kind of vocational technical world is always a boost anyway to students' knowledge and understanding, theory and practice. If that's what we're aiming to do, then you start your practice as soon as you possibly can, and we would absolutely agree with that and advocate for that. In the terms of early years, it's more of a requirement in a way, because you never get through your 750 hours unless you do so. What's important to note here is the part 1 and part 2. I know I've mentioned it more than once already, but that really is significant because it's different than other T-levels and other T qualifications as we will get to know them. And that is because of meeting the early years educator criteria. So students, it's telling us now on this slide, students must have achieved competence in all criteria before they can be considered for achievement of an early years educator technical qualification. Again, if you've been delivering early years educator qualifications, this is not new news to you at all, and it was very important to us, as it was for the Institute and the Department for Education, that these qualifications must meet the early years educator, and we have had many meetings already with the Department for Education to ensure that they are happy with how we are approaching that, and they have confirmed that they will be listed in the qualification as full and relevant, which is great news for students, great news for you, and also great news for employers, because the worst thing we want to do is detract people from the workforce. It would certainly be the wrong thing to do. So observations for assessment should not take place until the provider is confident that the student will be able to show an appropriate level of achievement during the observation. I think for part 1 of the early years pathway, occupational specialism, assessors will be going out to build that confidence, and when we get to the structured element, it is then when you think, okay, I now feel as though the student is ready to be seen at their best in a certain situation, and those certain situations are the ones that are going to be marked, and you'll know up front what those situations are, so that you can plan for that and you can work on that in class a little bit as well, and make sure the student is best prepared for their structured situation. Criteria will be assessed according to competence and working towards full competence. So they will have threshold competence, or they will have competence to go into the world of work. And in terms of an early years pathway or specialism, that means early years educator criteria. So here's an example then. So where it says in that in the table 1.1, we've got early years educator reference 1.1, then your criteria and assessed skills down there are the actual criteria from the DFE early years criteria. And that's why you'll see under there is professional discussion allowed. Yes, absolutely, because look at that massive range there. So students will be able to prepare for a professional discussion, and they'll be able to use their notes and things to be able to cover that range. And examples that they use will be examples from their placement, and they'll be able to share that discussion with the assessor following an observation. And this is part and parcel of part 1. Thank you. So we have another example here. This is looking at, okay, so thank you, Rachel. This is looking at 2.8. So we're looking at modelling and encouraging positive behaviours expected of children. Example of the skill there. 2.8 is the early years educator reference, and if you remember, there are 6 criteria that make up the early years criteria, early years educator criteria, and there'll be lots of range within that. So whilst you've got EYE criteria 1, there are lots of sub-criteria like the 1.1 we just saw, and so on, goes all the way up to 1.10, for example. So for 2.8, we're looking at positive behaviour, and it's giving you some guidance here, and how how you can sign that off, what you're looking for, and you will have your observation to be able to help you to do that. This is an example where it says professional discussion is not allowed, and that's simply because if we think about the practicalities, you really ought to be seeing that all of the time. I'm sure you would agree. So modelling and encouraging positive behaviour is something that you would expect to be part and parcel of that early year students' natural occurring behaviour.
I just want to come in and a little apology. I'm having considerable lag with positions. So going forward, if it skips over or you want me to go back or forward, do just let me know. I'm having a bit of technical lag, but hopefully it won't be too intrusive.
No problem. All good so far. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so just to recap, part one, early years educator criteria, it's skills competence, your assessors are going in, as assessors you're going in and you're making those professional judgments just like you always have. You're looking at, you're observing that student, you're having professional discussions with that student, and you're creating a cycle there. When you feel that that student actually is at their best and they're blossoming, they reach their peak, and you know that naturally happens. You'll know when the time is right. When that happens, you can begin the 3 structured observations. These are the ones that will be marked. More likely, this will be towards the end of their placement journeys, but you will know when that student is ready and at their optimum for this. So let's take a look at assignment 2. Thank you. So there are 3 separate structured observations. It's suggested here that you will do this towards the end of your delivery. Again, this is something that you will have some control over, but what we are trying to do here is just give clear messages about when your learner is ready. Each observation must be carried out once, so they're individual observations. You wouldn't do all 3 structured tasks in one sitting just because you might have the time to do so. These are 3 individual opportunities that allows your student to prepare in the best possible way, and they have got to be part and parcel of that observational cycle. And criteria bands will be provided for the assessor, so ranging from sort of 0, where you're not able to see any of that criteria, right through to 4, where you can. So we're going to look at some examples now. And the example here for a structured observation is looking at supporting learning and development. So the activity will assess the student's ability to support children's learning and development, making use of both planned and unplanned opportunities. And it then gives some sort of examples, and the structured observation can consist of one of the following activities. So you've got a bit of a range of things going on there, all of which are naturally occurring in an early years environment. And then you've got some mapping to the criteria, and hopefully there we go on the next slide, and we can see it now, Rachel, that's great. You'll see that you've got those marked bands there that are ranging from no markable achievement, which is extremely unlikely, through to 4. And it gives you an idea of the sorts of things that you could be asking about. That's fine, Rachel, thank you. So another example here, and on this example, we'll stay a little bit more on the marking criteria, if you like, and we can focus on that. We're contributing to an enabling environment, and again, these are examples, and you will receive a set of sample materials. So you will have an example at pass, and you'll have one at distinction. So you'll be able to gauge the in between. But that will hopefully help you and reassure you. So in this particular example, we will assess the student's ability, or the assessor will assess the student's ability to contribute to an enabling environment for children, making use of blanks. So it's the same sort of thing, and now you're given some different ideas of how to do that and different criteria. So when the student is preparing and planning for this, in that planning session, they really ought to be getting to grips with this criteria that's in the boxes there. And in this particular case, where you've got S, that is simply a skill that's related to the specification, so to the outline criteria. So it may not be an early years educator criteria in its own right. This is one of the skills that's within the specification, and it's being brought out in this way. And there's some more examples here. So we are now looking at one that is about promoting equality of opportunity and anti-discriminatory practice. And you're able to have a discussion around how you've met the range there, the assessed skills, ensuring individual needs and interests are considered in planning and provision of resources, celebrating diversity of culture and family backgrounds within the setting, modelling appropriate behaviour and where appropriate, confident in challenging discrimination. So some of these things you would expect to see, and other things you'll be able to tease out of a professional discussion with your student. And you've got then some of the marks. Just take a moment then to look at the marks, and that might be something you want to give some feedback on, for example. So we'll just hover, if we may, Rachel, on this slide for a moment.
No problem. Please do offer your feedback in the chat box. A couple of things that came up just talking about the early years educator. There was a question around whether the activity plans would be accompanied by practical evidence, or another question around practical evidence portfolios. If I understand those questions right, I think probably assignment 2 addresses that query about practical evidence. I think most of that will come in the form of the portfolio observations for assignment 2, but I don't know if you want to follow up on that, Janet, or if there are further questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. I'll take that question. So rather than the students creating a portfolio of evidence, there will be observation and there will be professional discussion, and there'll be planning and prep for that observation. So it becomes, even from the beginning, a little bit more structured in format, but the marking will come towards the end of that occupational specialism time and study. Students, whilst they are not necessarily creating a portfolio of evidence, they will be able to bring things into their professional discussion. And I would imagine that students would want to talk about what they've done and reflect upon what they've done with it as part of a planned professional discussion, for example. And if that means that they're referring to a document, then they can. But what's being judged and what's being marked will be the quality of that professional discussion and how that student is able to discuss the things that are part and parcel of this marking band. All of which they'll be able to see. So there'll be no secrets. They'll know what they're working towards, as will the employer, the mentor or supervisor. So this is very much a triangulation of bringing theory to practice and supporting that student to do well and maximise the learning opportunities. In terms of a traditional portfolio of evidence, slightly different, but professional discussions will allow students to talk and reflect and showcase things that they've done. I don't think anybody would want to deny students that.
Sorry about that. If I interrupt you, I'm sorry about that. No, just in addition to what you were just saying about the opportunity to plan this with the student and then record the discussions and talk about and recording afterwards, I just want to make sure everybody's on the materials tab that of the webinar panel. And in the competence observation guide, structured observation guide, if you look at those PDFs for session, you should be able to see the forms accompanying the observation that we lay out the structured way that all of those practical meetings and the planning of all of that is going to come together, just in case people hadn't already seen it. Before we continue, there was another question that came up. Wondered if you could comment on it, Janet, which was, again, with respect to early years, whether there were requirements for time spent in each age group. I think Claire asked that at some point.
Thank you. Yeah, and
just because.
Okay, that's a really good question, and again, you know, it's something that's going to be representative of the group out that are in the webinar today, who are representing early years in particular. Whilst what we haven't done and what we haven't proposed at this moment in time is a specific number of hours and so on in relation to early years, it's always good practice to be able to see that range, but the student will be able to work within 1 or 2 placements, and this is also something that's been sort of told to us, if you like, and something that's been a requirement of the institute, and so we are very much at their hands really in terms of that. So placement opportunities may well be focused. If you're in a day nursery, for example, that's great because you're going to be able to see the range, but we also appreciate and acknowledge that it might be that range is covered through professional discussion and so on. So I'm not answering the question definitively, and I'm aware of that, so I apologise. I think there are some prescribed perimeters that sort of insist on 1 or maybe 2 placements, especially when it comes to that structured observation format. So what will happen is that students will perhaps be in 1 age range, and we will be subject to discussions around differentiation across the age ranges. That is certainly something that happens now, and you know, something that we will build on for sure. And I'm hoping once we've got things signed off a little bit more neater with the institute, we'll be able to give a more definitive response there. So sorry for the vagueness.
I think that there's also questions around the extended hours for early years. So I think Marion earlier asked, was sort of floating the idea of whether the longer hours for early years, especially on the placement, was liable to put students off. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but a related question pops up from Lucy about the spec, saying that 80 out of the 750 hours would be spent on observation. Now, as I understand it, this has been revised to the hours that we've covered today, which is between 18 and 22 hours for those observations. But I don't know if you want to clarify that further, Jan.
Okay, so first of all, absolutely appreciate that if somebody's looking at this as a career option and they're thinking 750, you know, versus 315, for example, that it looks like a massive increase, as though the expectation is higher. For those people who are delivering either of these route specialisms, I probably would assume that the experience in placement would begin early regardless, because of that sort of, you know, you're either working towards structured observations without a part 1 for assisting teaching, so you want to give your students a really good run into that. You don't want them suddenly just being assessed within their placement. So I think in reality the placement experiences may be less different. However, on paper I take the point. It's not something that's new, so if you're delivering early years now, it will be sort of part of that, the mode of delivery and so on. And I just really, it will be about us. It will be about us as an awarding organisation, and about centres as well, being able to ensure that that these things are presented in a positive way. I think at the end of the day, the fact that by doing the qualification, by doing an early years educator qualification, those 750 hours are being accumulated in a sort of you know, a way to go to work, you know, a route to employment. They refer to it sometimes as a license to practice, but in terms of the early years foundation stage, it's giving you the opportunity to contribute to the early years educator, to the early years workforce. So I think it's about how we present it to the student, but point taken. There's a big difference between the two, and it's certainly something that we have to think about how we present that qualification, just as we always have done with early years qualifications, to be fair. What was the second point of the question? Sorry, Rachel.
Yes, there was
placement hours,
the second question, and I answered in a preliminary way, but I just want to make sure that I'm not saying anything incorrect. So if you could clarify, I would appreciate it as well. I think there was a version of the spec where it was suggested that there was 80 hours of the 750 for early years that was spent observing each student, but I understand this has been revised down to the 18 to 22. Is that right?
You're absolutely correct. So our current proposal is as stands on the slides that we've talked about today, and I'm sure people were packing up their tents to be able to follow their students around for 80 hours, which was a remarkable number of hours. So yes, please accept that we've moved on in our thinking. You're absolutely correct, Rachel.
And just a final interest note in that was students do enjoy the industry placement. So while lots of hours spent on the qualification can be intimidating, I think it's an important thing to remember, as has been brought up. Jill brought this up in the chat, that actually a big industry placement could as easily really attract a lot of students, because they enjoy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry, Rachel. Yeah, absolutely. I think what we remember or need to remember perhaps is the vocational side of this, and I think a lot of students come into this kind of a study wanting to actually get that kind of equity between theory and practice, and whilst it brings its own challenges, because I think it's difficult to be on one side of the fence as a student in a school or college, and then suddenly to be part of a working team, that brings its own challenges. It's good experience, and certainly one that prepares them for the world of work, so not to be underestimated.
Okay, from the structured observations, Janet, and then on assignment 3.
That's lovely, thank you. Let's move on. Thank you. Okay, so we've got another structured observation here that, oh, sorry, I think, okay, so we're looking at, I'm just catching up with the lag, so I think I'll be quiet and let the PowerPoint catch up with me. Okay, keep going, Rachel, I think.
I think it's obscured on the slides, so people are in. See, if you just give me 2 seconds and I'll move that for you.
Thank you. I can talk about assignment 3 while Rachel catches up on the slides. Oh, here we are. We're getting quite the double act now, aren't we?
Sorry about that.
So we've got an example there of structured observation 3, which is about meeting the individual needs of children. And you're looking here at contributing to care routines, snack or meal times, rest and sleep, personal care needs, and supporting children through planned transitions, moving from one age group to another, settling in, and so on. And students will be able to look at one aspect of that. So there's not an assumption in the structured observations that students will do all of these things, but that they will be able to find one of these opportunities. Care routines, that should be something that's naturally occurring, and you may well find that there are children going through some kind of transition at some point. So hopefully there's an element of choice, but there is certainly an opportunity in which to do well within these structured observations. And whilst these are only examples, and when you see the samples, they might be similar but slightly different, you will find that they're all around that, the idea of what are the key things that happen all of the time in early years in this case, and therefore what sorts of things will students be able to really show their blossoming skills within, and that's what this is about. This is not trying to push students too far or to catch students out. This is about making the most of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis and allowing them to gain points for that. So thank you, Rachel. I think perhaps we should move on to assignment 3 if we can. Lovely. So I'm just mindful of the time. So let's look at assignment 3. So assignment 1 was about planning. Assignment 2 was about practical skills. Assignment 3 now is thinking about observations. So a student will be doing observations themselves. They'll carry out a series of observations. We've got 3 observations here that the student does. They're given a booklet and they will complete 3 observations within this booklet, and they're using a range of methods there. And then what they will do, they will use those observations not to evaluate what they've seen, but to try and focus on the different types of methods and why we observe in the first place. So let's dig a little bit deeper, Rachel, on the next slide. So they will then come into college and they'll be thinking about these types of questions, again, under supervised conditions. So they'll be evaluating strengths and weaknesses of their own practice and skills in carrying out the different observations. What worked well, what didn't work so well, and so on. And thinking then about how they could engage in continuing professional development to improve their observational practice and skills. So thinking about, you know, what do I need to know more about in order to provide planning, next steps, and so on. What is it I need to find out more about, and how can I plan to do that? So this side of assignment 3 is very much a case of, can I carry out 3 observations in different methods, and do I really know why I'm observing and how these methods have been able to help me, and can I identify what I'm doing well and what I perhaps need to know more about. And that more about can really be about the wider foundation stage and about working with others and so on. But there will be guidance into how those marks are allocated. In part 2, you'll be given some actual observations that have been set by us. So these would have been created by NCFE Cash, different methods of observation. And so what we have, George is a very popular character, and George is here again. And what he's doing now, we have him in 3 separate situations, and we're observing him here in order to focus on his mathematical skills. I think that's what's coming out of this. And so once the student has looked at these observations and got a feel for these observations and George's ability, there are then some questions to answer. So you should spend the first part of this assessment reading the observation data provided in the insert. You should do this before attempting to answer the questions. So then we have questions like, identify and describe 3 different methods of observation used to assess George's mathematical development, and explain the purpose of each of these 3 methods of observation. So again, you're doing something similar to part 1, but now you're able to use observation data. And the reason why we didn't say, well, the students have carried out 3 observations, why can't they simply evaluate those, is just down to the objectivity of the, you know, the experiences that they may be having. So it was better in part 1 to focus on the power of observation and those different methods, and here to focus on set observations that have got equal opportunity for students, therefore, to be able to draw conclusions, which is indeed what they are doing here. Analyse the 3 observations, draw conclusions, plan for next steps, and give examples of what you would do to support George. So you can see the whole remit of the occupational specialism is about those core skills that an early years educator needs. They need to be able to plan with purpose, they need to be able to carry out skills with confidence, and they need to be able to use observation to intervene as appropriate. Thank you, Rachel.
And that brings us
very
to time.
swiftly.
I'm going to suggest that any more questions, if you could either hang on to them, and we'll hopefully have Q&A at the end of the day, or you can send them to the T-Level support email. And if there are existing questions that we didn't get to in this session, I do have those, and we'll be able to follow up with you individually. But I'm just mindful of the time, and we now have 14 minutes. So I'm going to say thank you, Janet, and thank you, everyone. Go and grab a cup of tea, and I'll see you back here in 15 minutes on the next link to hear from our colleagues in Learning Resources who are going to give us a tour. That's the support email address if you have any questions following this session. And I'll see you back here in a bit.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Janet.